thank you everyone, particularly Julia, as we navigated through these technical difficulties to get the session going. The most beneficial thing is that, Julia, all the attendees are really committed to hearing what you've got to say because they stuck around for the chaos. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Julia, who many of you know has recently started a full-time position at Massey University, and is going to be talking to us at a different slant for how often people address the topic of earthquake early warning, where we focus first on the social benefits rather than previous efforts, which have largely been focused on the scientific aspects of the early warning systems themselves. So really looking forward to hearing your presentation, Julia, and I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions afterwards. Go for it.
Cool. Thank you so much, Brendan, and just hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'll just try and talk nice and loudly. We've got obviously quite a few people online and a number of people in the room here as well who've come to listen. So yeah, very, very pleased to talk about this project and kind of what it might mean for New Zealand. So this project is really focusing on the social benefits of earthquake early warning in New Zealand. A bit of background behind the project was that we decided that a lot of countries have gone down the route of trying to look at technical systems and see how they work and how you can get a good earthquake early warning via a technical route. But given that New Zealand doesn't have a comprehensive early warning system, we decided to start from the people side of it and look to see what the social benefits might be before sort of starting to advocate earthquake early warning from a technical perspective. So I'd just like to thank, there's a whole lot of people behind this project, there's a whole lot of funders. The project was initiated through an EQC Research Biennial Award, but obviously lots of other people have contributed to it, both in New Zealand and internationally as well. So we've got some good linkages with Japan and the US too. So yeah, a huge thanks to all the people involved in that. So I guess just a little bit of background to start with. So maybe take you back to the QuakeCoRE earthquake and to think about earthquake early warning in that context. After the QuakeCoRE earthquake, obviously if you were close to the source, you would have felt the ground shaking very much immediately after the earthquake happened. But as people kind of got further and further away from the QuakeCoRE earthquake, so people in Wellington, people in Taupo, there was sort of a bit of a lag time between the earthquake actually happening down in QuakeCoRE and it shaking reaching places like that further away. And I was talking to Caroline yesterday, Caroline Holden, and she said that even in Taupo, GeoNet Rapid was able to get out an earthquake advisory before that shaking actually hit Taupo. So we know that it's possible to get a warning of impending shaking before it happens, and we see it in the QuakeCoRE earthquake itself. And so, how might this work in a New Zealand perspective then? So first of all, I'll just start off with giving a little bit of background about earthquake early warning for those who might not be so familiar with it. So what is an earthquake early warning? It's essentially a warning that you might get a few seconds to maybe up to a minute or 2 minutes at the most before shaking occurs in your location. So it's a little bit of time between when the earthquake happens in its source and when shaking actually occurs. And you can detect that in a couple of different ways. And a warning can be sent out in advance to notify people that shaking is coming. So how might you generate a warning? So essentially there's two key methods. So the first is really detecting the shaking at the earthquake source. And then once you do that, you can send out a notification to areas that are further away to let them know that shaking is going to be coming their way soon. Or you can use the faster P waves, which are kind of the waves that you kind of hear as a rumbling sound before the shaking occurs. You can use the detection of those to know that an earthquake's coming and then send out an advanced warning about that impending shaking. But I guess the difference between the P wave and detecting the shaking at source, often if you're just detecting the P wave, you might not get as much notice before the shaking occurs. It's a bit of a shorter warning, I suppose, if you like. So there's a question about how much warning time you actually get, and as you might have heard from what I was saying, it really just depends on where you are, where the sensors are located, how close you are to the source of the earthquake. Obviously, the closer you are to the earthquake source, the less time you're going to get in terms of warning. The further away, you're going to be able to get more time in terms of warning. And sometimes you can just be so close that you're not going to get any warning at all. So, for example, during the Christchurch earthquakes, there wouldn't have been any time for warning because Christchurch is pretty much sitting right over where the source of the earthquakes was. So you're not going to get a warning in every circumstance or every instance. And then the next question might be, what strength of shaking might you receive? So obviously, the closer to the source you are, closer to where the earthquake starts, you're going to get a lot more shaking. The shaking is going to be a lot more intense. The further away from the source you are, obviously you get more warning time, but the shaking is not going to be quite as intense. So there's sort of a little bit of a sweet spot somewhere in the middle where you're able to get a warning and the shaking is still strong enough for you to take some kind of actions that might be protective, I suppose. And you can see it in the image that's up there on the slide. That's an image from the Kumamoto earthquake in Japan. So there was sort of a set of earthquakes that were quite close together. You can see the yellow parts on the diagram are the prefectures to which the warnings were sent out. And there's a star right in the middle where the shaking was most intense. And if you look very closely, there's a 0 circle around that star, which really indicates the area where the shaking was most intense, but you didn't get any warning at all from that perspective. And the further you go out, the more time for warning you got. So the areas that are the centre of the earthquake and the most devastating ones potentially won't actually get a warning. So how's a warning disseminated? Essentially, you need some kind of threshold for sending out a warning. So you need to know whether it's going to be strong shaking, for example, and to be able to detect that and then send out a warning for that strong shaking. So they have an earthquake early warning system in Japan that's been there since about 2007. And they have thresholds of Japanese intensity 3 for more technical users. So, for example, if you kind of shut down operations or running trains or something like that, they'll send out a warning for those kind of lower levels of intensity. And then they have an intensity of 5L, 5 lower for the public, which is, I guess, kind of similar to kind of what we have in New Zealand in terms of our modified Mercalli scale. You also need a structure in place for how you have receipt and delivery of the warning. So you need your sensors, you need technology, you need infrastructure to kind of send that out. You might need multiple agencies to deal with that warning. So you need to have some kind of structure around the warning and how you send it out, how people receive it. And then warnings can be transmitted via all sorts of channels. So smartphones, other media devices, TV, radio, and in Japan, they are transmitted via a variety of those channels, I guess. In terms of the use of early warnings, you can break it into 2 components. So you have your automated functions. So that's where you want to automatically turn off something. For example, you might want to automatically stop an elevator so that it doesn't get stuck between floors, so that people can get out on a certain floor. And then you also have your procedural functions, which is more of a human decision-making process. So you get a warning and then somebody has to make a decision about what they're going to do. So for example, the rail system might get a warning and then they want to send a message to their train drivers to slow down the trains, which the train drivers do on receiving that warning. So that's more of a procedural action. So those are the 2 kind of main ways you can kind of split uses of early warnings up. In terms of systems around the world, there are a variety of different systems. I've listed a few. There'll be other countries that have bits and pieces to do with early warning as well, but just got a few up there. So Japan and Taiwan are quite well known. Mexico, you probably might have heard in the news about how Mexico City has sirens that warn people of incoming shaking, and then they have a slightly different response to people in Japan. So for example, people in Japan might stay in their buildings and drop, cover, hold, whereas in Mexico they're asked to evacuate onto the street so that they're not in dangerous buildings and unreinforced masonry buildings. So Daniel Blake, who was over in Mexico probably a year or so ago, he took a photo of one of the responses to the earthquake early warning in Mexico there. And the US is developing a shake alert system as well. So they're sort of in the process of trying to think about, what technology they use and then how people are going to react to that and how emergency managers have to respond in terms of planning. So now I've just got a really brief video which I'll show you, which hopefully everybody will be able to see and hear at your end. And if you haven't, it has got some subtitles as well, so you should be able to see what's going on. But I quite like this video because it is a video of the 2011 Tohoku earthquake early warning, and it just shows the kind of messages that people might have received and how they interpreted and kind of behaved in terms of those messages. And it'll be kind of interesting to reflect on this video, I think, as we go through some of the findings from our research later on in this presentation. So I'll get it started.
地方国交付税に1000億円
So you can see this is a broadcast of Parliament session.
このような対応を講じまして、
緊急地震速報です。強い揺れに警戒してください。緊急地震速報です。強い揺れに警戒してください。緊急地震速報です。
Which is not at all.
強い地域では強い揺れに警戒してください。宮城県、岩手県、福島県、秋田県、山形県です。揺れが来るまではわずかな時間しかありません。怪我をしないように自分の身の安全を守ってください。倒れやすい家具などからは離れてください。また、上から落ちてくるものに気をつけてください。緊急地震速報が出ました。宮城県、岩手県、福島県、秋田県、山形県です。怪我をしないように身の安全を確保してください。
So you're giving some information about protective action.
倒れやすい家具などからは離れてください。今この国会でも揺れを感じています。先ほど国会の中の揺れがまだ続いています。揺れが始まってから10秒以上経過しました。次第に
国会中継の途中ですが、地震津波関連の情報をお伝えします。今、東京のスタジオも揺れています。東京のスタジオも揺れています。緊急地震速報が出ました。宮城県、岩手県、福島県、秋田県、山形県に緊急地震速報です。また、今、東京渋谷のスタジオも揺れを感じています。東京渋谷のスタジオも揺れています。強い揺れを観測した地域の皆さんにお伝えします。落ち着いて行動してください。揺れが収まってから火の始末をしてください。まず上から落ちてくるものや倒れてくるものから身を守ってください。現在、東京渋谷のスタジオが大きく揺れています。東京渋谷のスタジオが大きく揺れています。建物の倒壊や山崩れ、崖崩れの恐れがあります。上から落ちてくるもの、倒れてくるものから身を守ってください。今、東京渋谷のスタジオが非常に大きく揺れています。東京の渋谷のスタジオが大きく揺れています。上から落ちてくるもの、倒れてくるものからまず身を守ってください。揺れが収まるまでしばらく安全な場所にいてください。揺れが収まってから火の始末をしてください。NHK で新しい情報が入り次第お伝えします。テレビやラジオのスイッチを切らないでください。午後2時46分頃、東北地方で強い地震がありました。震度7が宮城県北部です。震度7が宮城県北部。また、震度5弱が山形県、震度6強が宮城県中部、福島県中通り、福島県浜通り、茨城県北部、震度6弱が岩手県沿岸南部、岩手県内陸北部、岩手県内陸南部、宮城県南部などとなっています。
There's one last bit I want to show you just after this shot of the buildings.
いるのは大津波警報が宮城県、福島県です。大津波警報、海岸や川の河口付近には絶対に近づ
I'll just stop it there. The last part which I was showing you was really the linkages that they have there with earthquake information and tsunami information as well. So thinking about that is important. All right, after a bit of, I guess, a bit of background and a bit of kind of context on how some of these earthquake early warnings work in other countries, I just want to talk a little bit about the results of our research. So as I mentioned before, we were interested in looking at primarily the social benefits of earthquake early warning from a sectoral focus. So looking at kind of what key sectors like lifelines or emergency management or health and hospitals or schools, what they might think about earthquake early warning and how they might use it. And then thinking about the public and the public's opinion on whether they thought it would be useful and how they would use earthquake early warnings in New Zealand. So we did a number of focus groups just to ask people from key sectors about what they thought in Wellington, Napier, Christchurch and Auckland, and some additional interviews, and there's one or two I still need to follow up on. And then we also did a public survey. But before launching into the New Zealand aspect, we decided there was no point really asking New Zealanders about earthquake early warning if we didn't have some context from another country about how they actually used it in terms of the public and what their public thought about it. So we worked with a Japanese researcher as well to find out a little bit more about how the public in Japan use earthquake early warnings. And then just recently we've rolled out our public survey in New Zealand, which many of you may have filled out, so thank you very much for that. We got over 3,000 responses to that, so that was absolutely awesome. So we've got some great data. Yeah, so the Japan survey, a bit of context for that was we used an actual warning that people had received in Japan, and then asked some questions about how they responded to that. And that was a kind of a first, really. There was a little bit of literature out there on earthquake early warnings, and how people had responded in Japan, but it was the first time that anyone had actually used an actual example and gone out and asked people about what they'd done for the actual example. So I think it's a pretty cool piece of research. I just also wanted to mention that in terms of our focus groups and public survey, there's still quite a bit of underrepresentation from Māori, and really we haven't really investigated how Te Ao Māori sees earthquake early warning and how that kind of fits within that world. So I guess that's just a bit of a disclaimer as well. So some of our findings in terms of both focus groups and the public survey, I sort of combined them all together so that you can kind of have a reasonable summary across the board. So our general findings were that people in New Zealand did support an earthquake early warning system, even if it was sometime into the future. I think people had a bit of trouble thinking about what earthquake early warning meant and what it would look like in terms of them taking action. But I think kind of once they tossed around some of those ideas and some of those challenges that they might have around earthquake early warning, people were generally supportive. Even in places like Auckland, for example, where a lot of people see earthquakes as low risk, there was support from even kind of the lower risk areas, I guess, as well. We had, yeah, I guess as it says on the slide there, we did have some variation in opinion by focus group location. Everybody's had different experiences. For example, Canterbury people have had recent earthquake experiences. They focused a lot on, what would it mean in terms of aftershocks. People in Auckland were less sure about the risk that it might pose to them, although they might be the ones that might best benefit from something like that because they're further away from some of the sources. So there were a few differences across location. And when we asked the New Zealand public, so the overwhelming majority thought it would be useful or somewhat useful, which is very similar to some of the results we found in Japan as well, where 3/4 of the people thought the same thing. So people who had a system still supported its use in that country. An interesting finding was that across the board, the primary perceived use for an earthquake early warning system was really around health and safety. So whether you were in a sector, whether you were in water or emergency management, or whether you're from a school, or whether you're a member of the New Zealand public, primarily, most people thought about it in a health and safety context. So whether you could use it for drop covering and holding, so you get a warning and you get your staff to drop cover and hold, or you have your school children drop covering and holding, or in terms of health and safety functions. So some of the biggest gains I think that people talked about were in terms of getting people away from dangerous equipment, turning off dangerous equipment. You might be in a stadium, you could use it like for information for crowds, sort of in a health and safety context. So, what should the crowd be doing? So by far, that was the biggest perceived benefit was health and safety in New Zealand, which I thought was really interesting because it's a little bit different from maybe what some of the overseas work shows, and that when people are asked about how they could use it, they go straight into kind of the technical uses for earthquake early warning, but New Zealand has really thought about it in kind of a health and safety context, and it's first and foremost. The second primary perceived use was mental preparedness. Now this actually was quite a big surprise to us, because when we went into Japan, we thought, people will be like drop covering and holding and turning off fire equipment and using it for automated functions. But by far, most people in Japan valued the system for the fact that they could mentally prepare for shaking that was coming. They could kind of brace themselves. They could kind of make themselves prepared for the shaking that might be coming. And it was quite interesting to note that when we did the Japan survey and the New Zealand survey, 83%, we got exactly the same figure in both countries, saying that earthquake early warning was of huge benefit in terms of mental preparedness. So really interesting, and I thought it was a completely new finding. When we talked to the various sectors that were out there, obviously they gave different ideas for how they might use earthquake early warning in terms of acting before the shaking occurs. But I mean, I guess overall we found that participants found it quite difficult to imagine how they might use earthquake early warning in their sector, probably just because it was something they hadn't really been exposed to that much. So it really does require, I guess, a bit more thinking and a bit more working out with various sectors as to exactly how they might implement it. I found it quite interesting that a lot of the people we spoke to had reservations about either turning off or stopping functions that are hard to start again after the shaking. So for example, there's a picture of a reservoir, water reservoir up there. One of the people we spoke to said, we wouldn't really want to use an earthquake early warning to shut the valves on the reservoir, because it's absolutely painful and it takes a lot of time to kind of turn them back on again. People felt that they had other things that they could do. So for example, a lot of sectors had automatic switching. So if the shaking was strong enough, they could use the automatic switching to switch off a function as opposed to the earthquake early warning. And they felt that was kind of maybe more useful than turning off something that might end up being a false alarm, or then you have to kind of turn it back on again. So yeah, so there were definitely reservations out in the sectors about whether they should be using it to turn off things. But sectors I guess were more likely to consider using an earthquake early warning for action if something was easier to turn on again. So for example, in terms of transport, and there's a picture down the bottom there, you can see you could use it on road signs to say, we're closing the tunnel, we think it's dangerous for people to go through, don't go through. They can switch on that sign, and then they can switch it off really easily again afterwards, and you can keep using the tunnel if there's no problem. So yeah, so it was easier to kind of think of as useful if it was kind of easier to switch stuff back on again afterwards. So, I mean, some of the things we kind of teased out were some of the challenges for public response in particular, particularly based on the Japan experiences. So, in Japan, for example, we found that although people valued the system for being able to mentally prepare for shaking, there was actually a really low level of people taking protective action. So low level of people drop covering and holding, or a low level of people switching off fire equipment or gas or something like that. So people like to know what's coming, but they didn't actually do anything about it. And you can see that from the video that I just showed from the Parliament as well. People thinking about it and staying still. So people definitely prefer to stay still and motionless and kind of wait for the shaking to arrive. And whether this is a function of them just kind of waiting and seeing, or whether it's a function of them just kind of using environmental cues to see what was happening. If the shaking gets worse, I might drop. We didn't kind of tease that out, but there's probably aspects of all of that in there. One of the reasons that people didn't take any action was because they were basically just optimistic that the shaking either wasn't going to happen, or it wasn't going to be strong, or they weren't going to be impacted. So this is what we call kind of optimistic bias. So people had quite a strong optimistic bias that they were going to be okay. And this kind of happens across all sorts of facets in emergency management, I suppose. So it's not really a surprise that people would think that way. There was also, one of our questions is if you participate in a drill like shakeout, drop, cover and hold, or if you participate in a tsunami decoy, does this affect people taking action in future? So we tried to test that in the Japanese sense, but the levels of people actually doing some of those things like participating in drills or just like having access to education were quite low. So it was pretty hard to tease out, but that could be a factor. If people were involved in more of those things, you could see an increase in some of those actions. So in New Zealand, when we sort of did a bit of a comparison between the data, I mean, it's a bit hard to say because you're testing, what people actually do compared with what people intend to do, which can be a little bit kind of optimistic in itself. We found that people did have high intentions to take protective action or safety action. So they were quite optimistic that they would do something proactive, but whether they do or not, hard to know. Interesting research question in itself. But a proportion still anticipates staying still, waiting for the shaking as well. And that kind of third, that 30%, is quite similar to what you see in actual shaking data. So a lot of people, a third of people will stay still during actual shaking as well. So it kind of lines up with some of that data. So anyway, so definitely challenges around public response in terms of earthquake early warning are nice to have, but maybe not everybody does something. So some additional challenges included people raised, included some of the usual suspects, I suppose, that you probably think of. So you might get a warning, you might not be able to act in time, you might not receive the warning in time. So for example, Christchurch context again, you might not experience shaking after a warning. So that's kind of like a false alarm or false alert. But when we sort of asked the Japanese whether they were still happy with receiving the warnings despite having false alarms, quite a large number of them were still happy. So that's a third were happy, and then a third were kind of like somewhere in between, sort of somewhat happy. So people still had like kind of an appetite even with the false alarms or false alerts. And New Zealanders perceived that they would still be happy with having a level of false alarms as well. And then one of the things that particularly the focus group participants brought up was really you might get too many alerts basically. So if you were thinking back to the Canterbury earthquake situation where aftershocks were kind of coming in all the time, like how many times are you going to get alerted about a potential earthquake, even though you wouldn't receive one in that context, but if you had an ongoing aftershock sequence, you might be getting a lot of those alerts, and then what does that mean for you actually taking action? Perhaps not, perhaps you won't be. So, kind of getting to the end here, the New Zealand survey asked people about some of the warning specifications that they would like to see. I think again this is like a first time that people have actually asked the public about what they'd actually like to see, as opposed to just kind of made wild guesses about what they think they should put into warnings. So obviously the warning channel, mobile phones there was a huge preference, and that's really shown in Japan to be the case, that people do get their warnings on their mobile phones predominantly, so up in the 90% area. But then supported by other channels such as TV banners and radio announcements and public announcements. People talked about shaking thresholds. We asked them, what kind of level of shaking would you like to be warned at? And so in New Zealand they sort of said MM5, which is kind of moderate, through to MM6, which is strong. And I think, like, on going through some of the information there, the reason why people might say that is because when you look at those descriptions for the different MMs, it's when people start to feel it and start to be alarmed by it. So those were sort of two key words or two key concepts that come up. Once sort of people feel it and they start to feel alarmed by it, then they're going to want to have a warning. We asked people about sort of ideal warning timeframes, and it was quite interesting. We looked from sort of 0 through to 2 minutes and found that most people felt they would do something within the 3 second to 30 second bracket. Sort of beyond that, people found it a bit more difficult to think about what they do or what would be useful. And so it kind of, and they thought maybe they might worry about it a bit more if the warning time frame was too long. So yeah, so that was sort of seemed to be an ideal time frame for action. And then people also wanted supporting information in some of the messages, so things like additional hazards like tsunami. So if I'm on the coast and I feel an earthquake, I'm going to want to know about tsunami. You know, what to do, like for example, should I drop, cover, hold in terms of protective action? And then further information about the quake was something that was highlighted as well. So in terms of system preferences, there was a really strong call for integration in terms of the system. So the integration could be thought of in lots of different ways. So it could be across uses. So quite a few people talked about they're interested in hearing the warning, but also stuff like the post-earthquake ground shaking data was also important in helping them make a decision about what action they were going to take after the earthquake. So kind of having a breadth of information across those different uses was important for them. They wanted integration across technology, so things like network systems that could speak to each other, and warning technology, including emergency mobile alerts. So the government run emergency mobile alerts. Obviously that's a huge mechanism for warning, and so particularly the CDM sector was like, we need to kind of integrate or make use of that emergency mobile alert system if we were going to do this. And then across warning types as well. So as I was saying before, you know, if you're going to warn about earthquakes and you're living by the coast, you're also going to want to know about tsunami. And you can see in the diagram that's on this page, sort of outlines the JMA system where they are integrated. So they talk about, you know, an earthquake that's happened, give an earthquake warning, and then they like integrate that with tsunami information coming in as well. So essentially we kind of have both those things. Right, so to the conclusions now. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess overall, in summary, the primary benefits that kind of popped out of those focus groups and the survey included really health and safety, so personal protection, staff protection, you know, how do we protect lives, save lives, and this idea that mental preparedness was really important and useful in terms of earthquake early warnings. And obviously there was some discussion about other automated or procedural actions that might provide other benefits, particularly kind of easy turn off, turn on functions. But these kind of needed to be worked through a bit more with each sector, because it was pretty difficult for people to think about these on the fly, I guess. I mean, so some of the key questions that came up for me and that we kind of haven't answered yet. So what are the economic costs and benefits? So this study was never meant to look at kind of economic costs and benefits. So there might be some additional information you can kind of put into this to kind of help understand what would be useful. We know, for example, that you know, if you were going to use a GeoNet system, an enhanced GeoNet system, it could be very, very expensive. And maybe there are cheaper options as well, like network options that could be just a benefit. And then how do you kind of integrate those? The second question is really, is safety and wellbeing enough of a driver for earthquake early warning in New Zealand? I mean, I'm a social scientist, so I would say yes, of course it is. but yeah, I guess this is the call from people who want to use earthquake early warning. So I guess as a nation, we have to decide whether that is like, is that really important to us, and can earthquake early warning help with that? And then the last question really is, given the continued challenge of people not taking correct actions, I guess, how do you enhance response? I mean, it's all well and good if we're trying to sell this system on, you know, people being able to take action like drop, cover, hold, or turn off something dangerous, but you know, how do we how do we actually get people to do things that are going to keep them safe? And that's an ongoing piece of research that is really hard to solve. But yeah, but I guess looking at education and drills and effective warnings, that kind of needs to feed into all of this to find out how we can kind of motivate people to take correct action. So that's it from me. I do have some additional information if anybody wants to find out any more about it or find out about what we're doing, including the paper that we wrote in Japan. But yeah, I'm really happy to take any questions and try and answer them. I'm sorry, I know we're running a little bit late, but I'm happy to stay on the line for a bit longer for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Julia, for the really informative presentation. Happy to take questions from anyone on the call.
Can I go in? It's Ilan here.
Ilan.
It seems to me that there are 3 types of warning systems. One is the tsunami alert system, and then the early earthquake warning systems. One is one that triggers automatic responses in big infrastructure like trains, and one is that, and the other one is one that goes to individuals and potentially triggers some reaction from them, some kind of protective reaction. And the 3 systems are very distinct. The first 2 seem to me clearly the cost-benefit analysis for them is very clearly that they're much more beneficial than the cost. We don't have the first 2 yet. So I'm concerned about focusing on the third one through the surveys and so on without first establishing the first 2, and by concentrating on the third, potentially delaying the implementation of the first 2. I'm wondering what, I don't know if anyone has any thinking about that.
You said what were the first 2 again?
So a tsunami alert system, which is a completely different system to the earthquake early warning, and an earthquake early warning that will trigger automatic response in big infrastructure, like trains and big buildings where the elevators automatically stop and things like that. We know that in Japan, in the tsunami, in the earthquake in 2011, I saw that 15 high-speed trains were automatically stopped just before the shake reached them. So that meant that 15 trains didn't go off the rails, which would have been would have led to high mortality. So that's the system, the automatic system. You made that distinction, but I think that when we are evaluating the cost and benefit, which is my interest, is the benefits of the automatic one is much higher than one where you are actually asking people to respond, given all the difficulties.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think that basically there's a lot of complications with like notifying the public, which are beyond us asking them whether they're affected or not, or whether they'll drop them from the coal or not. And there's probably different layers to it, but I think you're right. So yeah, I guess I don't have the answers to some of those things. People obviously have an appetite, but whether that's the right thing to implement is kind of another question. Whether it's right to implement a public system, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, there are definitely some cheap things that you can do, I guess, in terms of like some of the automated functions, and some of those kind of, yeah, I'd like to say that they were kind of happening in New Zealand already, but I did go and ask people whether they were using those early warning functions for automation, and not many people are, but yeah. So there probably are some cheaper things you could do around there that would save money.
Julia, this is Brendan. I've got a kind of follow-up thought in the context of what Ilan was mentioning, which is in the context of that 3 different types of warning that Ilan was mentioning. I think in particular with the first 2, it's also the question of benefit to whom. And I think there's quite a clear divide between public and private sector in that regard. And that, to me, poses one of the big challenges, is that initially in the case of automated shutdown of critical infrastructure, even if the infrastructure is critical in New Zealand, most of the time that's privatized. And so one of the challenges is how do you have the initial adoption of such methods and features and services when it may accrue only to very limited people in the first instance, and therefore actually a private sector model may be initially a more viable way to start, albeit that once sufficient, shall we say, market penetration occurs, then a pivot to a public sector model that may become more overarching.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you. I mean, in Japan, for example, they have, I didn't sort of describe it fully, but they have sort of public aspects and they have private aspects where there are companies that pay in to receive earthquake early warning, which they then use to kind of switch off functions or do something like that. So it's not necessarily one size fits all. It's how do you kind of put all those pieces together, and maybe you're right, maybe some of those functions could happen privately as opposed to publicly.
Is there any compelling evidence from Japan or Taiwan or wherever that early warnings to the public have saved lives?
That is a very good question, Carol. Yeah, I think we've struggled with actually getting that data. I don't think anyone's done a comprehensive study on it just to kind of actually see kind of where people were located, where they received the warnings, how strong the shaking was, and what they did to prevent that or to, I don't, there's probably anecdotal evidence of it, but I don't know whether we've got a study that actually says, this is kind of this is what people are, this is the area, the great best area for warning, or the best locations for warning. This is what people did, and this is how it saved lives. Unless somebody else knows about one, and I'd be really interested to find out.
You never have the counterfactual, so there's no parallel universe without the early warning to know what the benchmark would be, right?
Yeah, that's true. But wouldn't that make a great QuakeCoRE project? We'll do that.
Any other questions for Julia? Okay, well, on behalf of all the speakers, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today and provide insights on the great research you and your team are doing. So just final parting announcements. Of course, this is one of the monthly seminars that we have, so please keep a lookout in the newsletters and social media for the subsequent presenters. And of course, if you are an attendee that are interested to present in the subsequent monthly seminar, please let one of the QuakeCoRE leadership or administrative team know. And look forward to seeing many of you again this time next month.
Well, thank you, Brendan, and thanks for your patience.
Sure, no problem.